Hey everyone, I'm HarvestBuildDestroy, and in this video I'm going to talk about older RTS games I'd like to see remastered. I've tried to avoid giving my videos clickbaity titles as much as possible so far, but for this particular topic, it seemed right. I'm actually going to at least mention quite a few more than 3 games in this video, but there are 3 in particular that fit my criteria for needing a remaster, and those are the ones that I will officially consider a part of my list. But I will touch on a number of others. Unfortunately, I couldn't get my screen capture software to work with some of these games, so I won't be able to include footage of all of them. Anyway, my criteria are pretty simple. I think a game needs a remaster if it's difficult to access on a modern computer, cumbersome to play due to a dated interface, in need of a graphical overhaul, and well known enough to warrant remastering in the first place. Just being a more popular older game isn't enough to warrant a remaster in my books. For example, Company of Heroes 1 might be 13 years old, but it still looks great, the interface is fine, and it's easy to get running on Steam, so I don't think it really needs a remaster. I feel the same way about Age of Empires 3, which oddly enough is getting a remaster. In that case, I suppose they're doing it because they're remastering the other 2 games, and its community is large enough that I'm sure plenty of people will appreciate the excuse for a new expansion pack. Personally though, I'd rather see a remaster of Age of Mythology, although I haven't put it on the list. I'm going to focus on games that fit more than one of my criteria as much as possible, and particularly those that are difficult to access. I'm going to start with a game that you might not be expecting me to include. I've mentioned a few times before that I'm not a big fan of RTS games with 1 resource economies. Resource management and base building are what drew me to RTS in the first place, and when you don't have at least 2 resources to balance as you decide how to expand your base and build an army, you've sacrificed something fundamental to what I love about RTS games. Most RTS players feel similarly about real-time tactics games, which do away with base building and resource gathering entirely. I just take it one step further. I'm willing to acknowledge when an RTS game executes this type of formula well, but it's not something that will ever hold my attention for terribly long. With that said, I'm more interested in the Command & Conquer 1 and Red Alert 1 remasters than you might expect. I've been looking into what we know so far recently, and it sounds promising. They're working with some of the original Westwood team members, and their approach seems to be exactly what I personally want out of a remastered version of a classic game. As one of the devs has said, this is a remaster. Our intention is to keep the story, script, and content as authentic as possible to the original games, while providing much higher fidelity with modern quality of life improvements. Another said, if you could turn back the clock, what would you have wanted in the original CNC games? How true of a remaster should we adhere to? What modern improvements can be added without deviating from the core game? Balance changes? It's not clear yet what they mean by quality of life improvements, but I'm going to go ahead and assume that one of these will be the ability to use the standard right-click to move RTS interface, which every CNC game has included as an option since Generals. I've got my fingers crossed that hotkeys for the sidebar will be another. But for me, the true make-or-break change will be whether or not they include proper fog of war based on unit vision. A huge part of what makes RTS games so interesting competitively is that they are limited information games, and the lack of fog of war in Westwood-era CNC games has always been an extra barrier preventing me from wanting to play them, on top of the left-click to move interface. Anyway, this brings me to the first game on my list, which, perhaps obviously enough, is Red Alert 2. I've hardly got my finger on the pulse of the CNC community, but it's always seemed to me that RA2 is the fan-favorite entry in the franchise, and I guess that's almost true by definition, since it's the final Westwood-era CNC game. It's certainly my favorite CNC. But one thing that not only the CNC community, but the RTS community at large seems to almost unanimously agree on is that the CNC franchise has basically gone to the dogs under EA. The overall consensus opinion on the EA-developed CNC games seems to be that Generals was pretty good, CNC 3 was alright, Red Alert 3 was kinda blah, and everything after that was an embarrassment to the franchise. The remastering of the first 2 Westwood CNC games is an encouraging sign that perhaps EA is starting to learn their lesson. Red Alert 2 is almost too obvious to include on this list, since realistically it is going to happen at some point, unless the CNC remasters bomb really badly or something, but I'm going to include it anyway. I think Red Alert 2 could sustain a much larger player base than it currently does if it was easy to pick up and play, and I think I would even play it myself, at least for a while. As of right now, you have to get it on EA's Origin client to play it on a modern machine, and at least in my experience, that version of the game is a buggy mess. I couldn't get it to work with my screen capture software either, so I won't be able to include any footage. If you want to play the game smoothly with a high resolution, you have to play it on CNCnet, and as far as I know, that only works in multiplayer. Red Alert 2 might be the fastest RTS game out there. I don't mean that in the sense that it requires a high APM to play well, as it utterly pales in comparison to StarCraft, Age of Empires, and even Warcraft III in that regard, but rather that the average game is only a few minutes long. If Red Alert 2 Remastered were to come out, matchmaking and all, and you had, say, 15 or 20 minutes to kill before you had to leave the house or something, you could conceivably play a handful of games in that time. Even if it's not my absolute favorite RTS game in the world, there's something to be said for that. That's barely even enough time to hit the Castle Age in Age of Empires if you open with feudal aggression. You might even be pushing it to play a full game of StarCraft II in that time. However, how much I would personally end up playing Red Alert 2 Remastered would hinge on whether or not they decided to include a proper Fog of War system. I realize that it's possible that this might not be so well received by its current online player base, and I suppose that in theory that's the market the game's multiplayer should be geared toward, but I nonetheless kind of suspect that they might gain more people than they'd lose by adding it. I suspect that there are plenty of people out there who have fond memories of playing the early CNC games and haven't played them for many years, but have played other RTS games since. I think that market would rather play Westwood CNC games with Fog of War, whether it's in single or multiplayer, and I think that market is vastly larger than CNCNet's current active player base. Normally, I think making major gameplay changes like this to a classic game is an absolutely terrible idea, but I think this case is actually an exception. And they could also just make it a toggleable option. From what I've seen of modern Red Alert 2 competitive play, the addition of Fog of War would probably change build orders, as players currently seem to open with a number of attack dogs to scout the map and catch wandering engineers. If the vision of your opponent's base that you're uncovering with these early scout units wasn't permanent, it would probably change things. I can certainly sympathize with current Red Alert 2 players who might consider adding Fog of War sacrilege, though, at least on some level. I would have felt the same way if Blizzard removed the 12-unit selection cap in StarCraft Remastered, or if Microsoft had decided to add the Age of Mythology autoqueue to Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition. But nonetheless, I'd like to see unit vision-based Fog of War with explored maps in multiplayer in Red Alert 2 Remastered. There are a couple of other CNC, or at least CNC-style one resource games that don't quite fit my criteria that I'll briefly touch on as honorable mentions before moving on to number 2 on my list. The first is CNC Generals, which I probably wouldn't end up playing myself in remastered form, but that I think would be a very good thing for the RTS genre as a whole. The main reason I'm not particularly interested in revisiting Generals is kind of a specific nitpicky thing. The problem I always had with it is that, at least back when I played the game, you had to sell your command center at the start of the game to be truly competitive, which meant playing with no minimap for a decent part of the game. I guess you could make an argument in favor of a more deliberate and controlled mechanic that disables your opponent's minimap for a period of time, but personally, a game featuring that kind of mechanic is one I want no part of, no matter how well implemented it is. To be fair though, I doubt it was the developer's intention for players to sell their command centers at the start of the game and play with no minimap, but it led to me playing GLA, who need a radar van rather than a command center for minimap access, which was easier to squeeze into a build order. I played Zero Hour for a month or two around 2006, mostly because I was a massive fan of the pre-YouTube web series Pure Ownage, the main character of which incidentally also played GLA. I actually went to a few of the episode premieres in downtown Toronto, and was even the last person to get a signature at the premiere for the final episode. I've unfortunately since misplaced the shirt I had signed, but I stopped wearing it not long after the premiere anyway, although not because I was worried about the signatures washing out. It was the pro breakfast shirt, and well, I got pretty sick of explaining what it meant to people. I think they usually assumed it was some kind of sexual joke. Anyway, unless the minimap thing were no longer in the game, I doubt I'd want to play Generals Remastered myself, but like Red Alert 2, I think it could sustain a larger player base if it were easier to access, and as such, its existence would be a net positive for the genre. I guess I should mention Tiberian Sun while I'm at it, but I suspect that would be a one-off nostalgia campaign run sort of game, not one that would sustain a multiplayer community in the long term. Another game I'd originally thought to include on my list was Battle for Middle-earth 2, but I recently found out there's already a fan-made remaster in the works called Battle for Middle-earth Reforged. However, it seems more like a remake meant to capture the spirit of both games than a strict remastering of either, although I can't seem to find anywhere on their YouTube channel or website that gives a straight answer about this. At least from what I've seen of their YouTube videos, it doesn't look like buildings will be built on BFME1 style grids, which at least for me is great. I actually wasn't a fan of BFME1 at all. As I mentioned before, resource management and base building are what drew me to RTS, so a one-resource game where you build buildings on a predetermined grid really isn't for me. But BFME2 was a little more up my alley, and it's pretty hard to access in 2019, so I'd be more than happy to see a remaster. But from what I understand, EA's Lord of the Rings license has expired, so an official remaster is unlikely. BFME Reforged is the closest we're likely to get, and honestly, I've been impressed by what I've seen of their YouTube videos. It'll also be completely free to play, which might make it easier to get people to try it. I played BFME 2 for about a month or so when it was fairly new before the expansion came out, and enjoyed it quite a bit for what it was. I'm never a fan of automated resource gathering, but I liked the way it was implemented in BFME 2 better than I'd ever seen done before at that time. Each farm you build generates resources automatically, but its level of productivity varies based on how close it is to your nearest other farm. I liked how this rewarded players who were able to defend larger portions of the map. I also thought the game incorporated hero units and global abilities pretty well, and I enjoyed using cavalry to trample enemy infantry and using pikes to defend my own. It's been 12 or 13 years since I last played it, so it's difficult to say for sure, but my gut instinct is to say that it might be my favorite EA-developed RTS game. However, it's certainly possible that I'm a little biased toward the Lord of the Rings IP. I always thought it was kind of a shame that the RTS with the rights to the Middle-earth universe was a fast-paced one-resource game, though. I always felt that a larger-scale game with multiple resources would have been a much better fit for the epic scale of Tolkien's world. And yes, I am indeed biased toward Age of Empires. Anyway, the last game I want to mention before I move on to the official number 2 on my list is one I don't have terribly much to say about. It's called Dark Reign: The Future of War. It's a game that got swept aside during the golden age of RTS, but was well received by everyone who actually played it. I only found out about it years and years later and was only ever able to get a hold of the demo version, but it seemed like it was the best CNC game that wasn't actually a CNC game. I suppose it's not popular enough to truly warrant a remaster, but it's as solid of a hipster RTS as you're likely to find. Alright, without any further ado, the second game on my list is Total Annihilation, although realistically we probably won't ever get Total Annihilation Remastered. There are a couple of fan-made versions, but none have gained much traction, although TA Spring was more active than the base game years ago when I originally tried them. Even if we do get a TA Remastered though, Chris Taylor probably won't be involved. He made Supreme Commander a new IP because Atari owned the rights to the franchise at the time, and these days they belong to a company he's no longer a part of. It's sorta like Demon's Souls Remastered. Everyone wants it, but From Software made Dark Souls a new IP rather than Demon's Souls 2 because they didn't have the rights. But ignoring the likelihood of it actually happening, a fancy updated version of Total Annihilation is something I would actually play. Even if it doesn't, strictly speaking, fit my criteria quite as well as the other two games on my list, since you actually can get it on Steam these days. But as far as I can tell, you can't play the Steam version online without Game Ranger, so it's still not exactly accessible in multiplayer. As for my experience with TA, it's one of the non-age/craft RTS games that I've liked the most, although I haven't played terribly much of it myself. As I said in my video on how RTS games die, I spectated quite a few high-level games, but didn't actually end up playing any myself, at least online. I was only able to track down a copy of it maybe a year or so before Supreme Commander came out, and by that time, the online population was pretty tiny. To play online, you had to install a third-party client called Warzone, and there were generally only 20 or 30 players online at once. The community seemed pretty inviting, though. I managed to befriend the top player at the time, a guy who went by the name of Anarchy Diablo, if I'm remembering correctly. He let me spectate a bunch of his games versus other top players, and even though it seemed extremely figured out, it still seemed deep and compelling, and I remember wishing I'd been around when the game was more active. On land maps, the meta consisted of spamming one unit, and yet despite that, there still seemed to be plenty of room for the better player to gain advantages and impose his will. But when I brought up the idea of, actually playing TA myself, my new friend told me something that's always stuck with me, and served as the impetus for my video on how RTS games die. He told me not to bother, and to just wait for Supreme Commander, which was within a year of release. He was right, too, and that's sort of what that video is about. Everyone who still played TA at that point was really good, and it probably would have been ages before it had won a single game. Anyway, that's why I would selfishly like to see a Total Annihilation Remastered. It seemed like a great game that I just sort of missed out on. It also seemed like a game that desperately needed a patch, what with the one-unit spam meta and all. It's obviously a classic of the genre, and none of its spiritual successors have appealed to me. On paper, I feel like I should have liked Supreme Commander 1 a lot more than I did, but oddly enough, I've never really been a big fan. It's difficult to put my finger on exactly why. I guess it was always a bit laggy, even though I had a modern computer at the time, and I never really liked its visual style as much as TA's. I didn't like the scroll wheel zoom thing either. I guess for me, for whatever reason, it just lacked TA's intangible charm. I played it for a week or so when it first came out, and then decided it wasn't for me. The way Supreme Commander 2 altered its resource system seemed to round down the edges of what made TA-style games interesting, so I wasn't a big fan of it either. Admittedly, I haven't even tried Planetary Annihilation, but I honestly don't have the desire to. The multiple planets thing just doesn't appeal to me. But for whatever reason, emotional or otherwise, TA was different for me. But even if TA Remastered were to come out, realistically, it's not a game I would end up playing for years and years. Even though I think its resource system is really ingenious, at the end of the day, it's still fully automated. You build buildings which automatically generate resources. I like worker units. My channel is called HarvestBuildDestroy for a reason. For me, killing my opponent's workers is the most satisfying thing to do in an RTS game. But still, TA is great, and I'd love to see a remaster if the legal hoops could be jumped through. It deserves to be played more than it currently is, and it would be cool if the developers made it easier for anyone who wanted to. Anyway, the last game on my list, and far and away the one I'd be most interested in playing myself, is Warcraft II. You can still get it running on a modern computer, but how to do it is not exactly well publicized. To get it, just find Warcraft II on Blizzard's Classic Games page and follow the link. I got it for $13.29 Canadian. Its interface is even more archaic than Brood Wars, but despite that, it's still a lot of fun to play. You can only select 9 units, there's no auto-mine or multiple building select, no rally points, and you can't even queue up more than 1 unit or upgrade at a building, but you can use F2 through 4 for camera hotkeys. If the game were to be remastered, I think I'd like to see its interface modernized a little, but not too much. I think there's probably a threshold of modernness that it shouldn't cross. I'm not exactly sure where the line would be, but I think beyond a certain point it might lose some of its charm as a classic game and end up feeling like a lackluster modern one. Maybe the hotspot would be somewhere around the level of Brood War's interface. 12 unit selection cap, 5 unit or upgrade build queues and rally points, but no auto-mine or MBS. Anyway, despite its interface limitations, like all classic 90s Blizzard games, Warcraft II is overflowing with charm. The unit voices, the music, the art style, everything. Building a base, making units, and doing all your standard RTS stuff is inherently satisfying in Warcraft 2. As I've mentioned a couple of times in previous videos, I definitely have some issues with its overall RTS formula, how its economy works, and so on, but that doesn't mean I wouldn't play it anyway. I love Dark Souls 1 as well, but to say it's a flawed game would be rather an understatement. As for what I'm not as big a fan of in Warcraft 2 more specifically, I just don't think the relationship between gold and lumber is anywhere near as elegant as that between minerals and gas in StarCraft. I've talked about this a few times before, but it bears repeating here. Both games have a primary resource, which is used for absolutely everything, and a tech resource that is used in varying degrees for more advanced units, buildings, and upgrades, but the natural restrictions on your rate of collecting these resources has a pretty strong effect on how the games tend to play out. The rate-restricted nature of Vespene gas collection forces the player to make strategic choices between tech, higher-tier units, upgrades, etc., because you can't do them all at once without expanding, which will leave you vulnerable to a player who focused on mass unit production. If you know how many bases your opponent has and you see certain gas-heavy threats on the map, you can rule out others. This gives you a lot of room as a player to adapt to your opponent and make meaningful choices. Gold and lumber don't really work the same way. Gold is semi-rate restricted, since you can fit 10 or 15 peons on a gold mine, and lumber isn't really restricted at all. You can chop more or less as much lumber as you want off a single base. Expanding just increases your overall production capacity, rather than access to a more scarce tech resource. I never thought the third resource, oil, was incorporated very well either. Everything that costs oil, which is mostly just naval units, buildings, and upgrades, also costs gold and lumber. You're not really balancing the resources the way you do in Age of Empires, where there are units, upgrades, and buildings that cost every combination of the game's 4 resources. Oil is basically just an extra layer of investment required to take the water. You have to invest gold and lumber into oil tankers whose only function is to gather oil for your navy. Honestly, I don't think naval combat has ever been done particularly well in an RTS. I suppose Total Annihilation and Supreme Commander handled it better than most other games, since there was at least a wider variety of naval units in those games, but I've yet to encounter an RTS game where most players prefer water maps to pure land maps. In most RTS games with naval combat, there are generally only a handful of ships, usually some kind of 3-unit rock-paper-scissors combo, and there's usually one ship that's slightly less bad versus its counter unit than the others, so most players just spam that unit. Also, in general, having 2 separate terrain types, land and water, which only one or the other unit type can move through, just doesn't seem like the most interesting gameplay mechanic to me. Age of Empires 2, for instance, has a wide variety of different map and game types that play quite differently, and you have players who only play Arabia, Arena, Black Forest, Deathmatch, and so on, but I've never heard of an Age of Empires player who only plays water maps, or even predominantly water maps. They crop up in tournaments here and there, probably for variety more than anything, but they seem to be pretty unpopular. In Warcraft 2 competitive play, there seems to be only one map that anyone plays, and it doesn't have any water on it, so for all intents and purposes, you can pretty much ignore the oil resource. Anyway, who knows if we'll ever actually see Warcraft 2 reforged, but to me it seems like a license to print money. I'm sure lots of people would play it, and I doubt it would involve terribly much labor investment on the developer side. Despite whatever issues I may have with it, it's still a lot of fun to play, and it's obviously a classic. Blizzard seems to be proud of their past titles and inclined toward keeping them well preserved, so I wouldn't be completely surprised if we see a Warcraft 2 Reforged announcement sometime after Warcraft 3 Reforged. I suppose it's most likely a lower priority than Diablo 1 or 2 remasters, but hey, fingers crossed. But that's all for this video. As always, thanks for watching, and remember to subscribe, hit the bell, and all that. See you soon.